Welcome to the GI Map Test Deep Dive. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive into everything there is to know about this functional stool test. So if you're someone that struggles with gut issues and have been told by health professionals in the past that your test results and symptoms are normal, I'm going to show you how the GI Map Test can uncover what's really going on inside your gut. We're also going to dive into a few case studies from some of my previous clients so you can see this test in action and how it's helped so many people uncover the answers behind their gut issues. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Marianne, and I'm a certified holistic nutritionist that specializes in gastrointestinal health. So a little bit about my gut healing journey. I struggled with gut issues for 8 years, where I was constantly bloated after everything I ate. I was constipated to the point where I had to be hospitalized because I didn't have a bowel movement for 30 days. I was a gassy girly. I was tired all the time, and I would suffer from random bouts of severe abdominal pain. So when it comes to gut issues, I really did have it all. And I got caught in this vicious cycle of going to different doctors and specialists who ran a bunch of tests like blood work, MRIs, ultrasounds, endoscopies, colonoscopies, but all of these tests came back normal. So I felt like I was constantly looking for the next best thing to try or for someone to point me in the right direction when it came to healing my gut. Now, when I decided to go the more natural route and go to naturopaths, they had suspicions on what they thought was going on in my gut. So they recommended random supplements for me to take. But because there was no proof or actual evidence to back up those suspicions, the supplements weren't effective in improving my symptoms. So when I went to school and learned all about functional testing, I was so frustrated that no one told me about this or even offered it as an option. So of course, when I became certified, I ran this test on myself and it lit up like a Christmas tree. So we're going to go over these results as well as some unique case studies from my previous clients when we go over the case study section. So first off, what does an unhealthy gut look like, and how do you know if your symptoms are an indication that something is off in your gut? So the number one symptom that people come to me with is, of course, bloating. And bloating is actually a natural part of the digestive process. And it's actually a positive sign that your digestive system is doing its job. But if you're someone that struggles with looking 6 months pregnant after eating or at the end of the day, this could be a sign that your gut does need a little TLC. So some other symptoms might include abdominal pain and discomfort, irregular bowel habits like constipation and diarrhea or fluctuating between the two, heartburn and reflux, frequent gas that can be foul smelling, unexplained skin issues like rashes, acne, or eczema, intense cravings for high carbohydrate or sugary foods, and chronic fatigue. So what is the GI Map test and how does it compare to a standard stool test that you would get through your doctor? So the GI Map test uses PCR testing, and I find that a lot of people are familiar with this now because it's the same form of testing that was used for COVID. So this is able to identify any imbalances or insufficiencies in the gut. But it's important to note that the GI Map test looks at the large intestine. So it doesn't give any indication if there is bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. But with that being said, there are clues and patterns on the GI Map test that may point to potential overgrowth in the small intestine as well. And we're going to go over all of that when we dive into the test. So the standard stool test that you run through your doctor is going to look at more acute infections. So things like pathogens, parasites, and viruses. Like, for example, if you got food poisoning or a virus while traveling, it's going to be able to pick up on that. And it's also going to be able to detect if there is blood in your stool. But if all of these markers come back positive or come back and there was nothing detected, then they're going to send you on your way. And that's basically the end of the road. But there's so much more to investigate when it comes to the gut. And that's where the GI Map test comes in. So we're going to break down each section of the test and what it can uncover and tell you about what's really going on inside your gut. So the first section looks at bacterial, parasitic, and viral pathogens. Now, I don't see these come back a whole lot on the GI Map test, but when they do, it's usually E. coli, Salmonella, or C. diff. These are going to be really important to identify because these pathogenic infections drive inflammation in the gut. and have a ripple effect on other areas within the gut microbiome. So when these do come back elevated, it is crucial that they are addressed, like I mentioned. Helicobacter pylori, also known as H. pylori, is a bacterium that lives in your stomach, and it thrives in an acidic environment because it's able to neutralize the acid around it and create almost like a protective shield that allows it to thrive. And in turn, this is going to deplete your stomach acid levels. So H. pylori is typically associated with upper GI symptoms. So things like nausea, heartburn and reflux, frequent burping, and a feeling like there's a brick in your stomach after eating. So a lot of people actually have H. pylori, but are asymptomatic. But when I do see this come back elevated on a test, I always address it because it can have a major impact on everything else downstream. And it can be a contributing factor to things like dysbiosis and SIBO as well. So your commensal and keystone bacteria are your gut's good guys. So these are going to be what help break down your food. They produce vitamins, they support our immune system, and they play a key role in preventing inflammation in the gut. They can also help to prevent harmful bacteria and opportunistic pathogens by keeping them in check and preventing them from taking over in the gut. Now you can see in this picture here that your bacteria actually runs on a scale. So you can have too low amounts, or you can have too much of a good thing as well. And both of these are going to present as very similar symptoms. So your opportunistic microbes are the bad guys. And even though these are bad, we still do want a small amount of them present within the gut because it's all about creating balance. But when we do have this bacteria start to flourish, that's when we can start to see unwanted symptoms like bloating, abdominal discomfort, gas, constipation, and diarrhea. So I want to point out that this is why it's so important to run a GI map test to see where your bacteria levels are at, because some practitioners might evaluate your symptoms and automatically suspect dysbiosis, which is an overgrowth of bacteria, when in reality, you might have low amounts of beneficial bacteria. So if they recommend something like a gut detox and taking an antimicrobial, this is going to make your symptoms worse. Or if they recommend taking a probiotic, but your beneficial bacteria are really high, this is going to be something that also makes your symptoms worse because both situations present as very similar symptoms. This next section looks at different types of yeast and fungi in the gut. So Candida is naturally present in the body, and it plays an important role in influencing our gut health. But like bacteria, it can start to create problems if we have too much. So this can cause damage to the intestinal wall and lead to more systemic symptoms like brain fog, skin issues, and fatigue on top of digestive concerns. So the GI map test also looks at a long list of parasites that might not be able to be detected from a stool test that you run through your doctor. And if you've had a bout of food poisoning or sickness when traveling, this is going to be able to detect any parasitic infections that may have been contracted. Lastly, we're going to go over some important intestinal health markers that can tell us a lot about how your digestive system is functioning. So steatocrit is a marker that detects fat in stool, and this is going to give an indication of malabsorption, maldigestion, and bile flow. Elastase 1 is an enzyme secreted exclusively by the pancreas, and this is going to give insight into your body's enzyme production as well as pancreatic functions. So beta-glucuronidase is an enzyme that helps break down toxins and hormones in the gut, such as estrogen. So it actually reactivates them, allowing them to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream. And when we have this come back elevated, it can actually lead to things like estrogen dominance and toxic accumulation. Occult blood is going to be able to detect blood in your stool. Secretory IgA looks at your gut's immune function. So low levels can indicate a suppressed gut immune system, whereas high levels can indicate an elevated immune response from things like bacterial infections, food poisoning, and stress. Now, when I see this elevated, it's usually a sign that someone has been dealing with something more recently. So their immune system is put into overdrive. But when I see that on the lower end, it may mean that someone has been dealing with something for a more prolonged period of time. And because of this, their immune system has become weakened and worn down. Antigladulin assesses the body's tolerance to gluten by looking at its immune response. So gladulin is a protein that's found in gluten, and antigladulins are antibodies produced by our immune system. So when we eat gluten, if this comes back elevated, that means we're having a negative response to foods that contain gluten. Calprotectin is the gold standard for looking at intestinal inflammation. So this can be elevated due to things like intestinal infections, food allergens, IBD like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, polyps, and colon cancer. And finally, zonulin is a protein that wears down tight junctions in the gut lining. So these tight junctions are what keep out things like undigested food particles, bacteria, and debris from entering into our bloodstream. So when we have elevated levels of zonulin, this can indicate increased intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut. Now we're going to dive into the case studies and have a look at some unique GI map test results from some of my previous clients. So something that I do want to make note of before we dive in is that the symptoms that these individuals were experiencing and that a lot of people come to me with are very similar. There might be slight variability in terms of maybe someone's dealing with upper GI symptoms or differences in their bowel habits. But when it comes to the symptoms that people experience with gut issues, they are pretty much the same. And even though they look very similar, we're going to dive into how different each person's gut is in terms of what's really going on inside and why this one size fits all approach isn't going to be effective for everyone when it comes to healing the gut. The first test that we're going to dive into are my results. And as you know, I struggled with bloating, constipation, abdominal pain, foul smelling gas, and fatigue, all of which kept getting worse for years. So when I ran a GI map test, after all doctors and specialists told me that my symptoms and test results were normal, let's have a look at what was really going on inside my gut. So the first marker that came back was H.Pylori. And as we know, this bacteria is associated with upper GI symptoms, but I was actually someone who was asymptomatic. So I didn't have any of the reflux, heartburn, or nausea, or that feeling like there's a brick in my stomach after eating. But like I mentioned before, this is really important to address because of the impact that it has on everything else downstream by depleting our stomach acid levels and opening the door for unwanted invaders, which we're going to have a look at when we take a look at the different organisms that were found in my gut. Now looking at my gut's good bacteria, my levels were really low, and this can be for a number of different reasons. So I followed a low FODMAP diet for years and restricted a lot of foods because I was convinced that food was the culprit behind all of my gut symptoms. So I wasn't feeding my gut's good bacteria. I also went through a phase where I was on different rounds of antibiotics when I was sick. And I also had a hip replacement surgery, which again, I was on rounds of pharmaceuticals. So these are what kill your gut's good bacteria. And I never focused on supporting or replenishing them after that. The elevated bad bacteria and yeast in my gut can definitely be a result of having low levels of good bacteria and the elevated H. pylori that was detected. So the H. pylori was neutralizing my stomach acid and giving these guys the opportunity to get into my system. Also, my food wasn't getting broken down properly, so it was acting as fuel for these organisms to thrive. Not having enough good bacteria also means that these weren't able to crowd out these microbes, essentially giving them the opportunity to take over in my gut. Lastly, looking at my intestinal health markers, my elastase enzyme was low, which is going to impact the breakdown and absorption of food. Also, beta-glucuronidase was creeping up into the red. So this may indicate that my drainage pathways were not functioning properly. So that's going to be really important to support. Also, zonulin was something that was creeping into the red as well. So this can definitely contribute to intestinal inflammation. So you can see that there were a lot of factors that were contributing to my symptoms. And this wasn't just a normal test that I have been told by so many health professionals in the past. So prior to running the test, I was convinced that food was the culprit behind all of my gut issues. But in fact, restricting my diet was actually contributing to the problem. So I also experimented with things like parasite cleansing, colonics, and taking random supplements like L-glutamine and a probiotic. And it's not necessarily that these things are bad, but the execution of how I was using them wasn't effective in targeting the issues that I was dealing with, which is why I didn't notice any improvements in my symptoms. Now for the second case study, we're going to have a look at some of the clues and patterns on the GI map test that can point to potential overgrowth in the small intestine, also known as SIBO, being present. So this individual was struggling with symptoms of lower abdominal bloating and discomfort, constipation, excessive foul smell and gas, acne, hair thinning, and fatigue. So first, we found elevated levels of H. pylori, which is really common to see in cases of SIBO, because after food exits your stomach, it enters into the small intestine. And if you have low stomach acid levels, any bacteria or food particles that haven't been targeted or properly broken down now act as food that feed the bacteria in the small intestine, and over time, it can cause it to flourish. Next, we found that she had really high levels of good bacteria. And when it comes to the gut, it's all about balance. So you can have too much of a good thing. Now, a common misconception with SIBO is that it's bad bacteria that's overgrown in the small intestine, but that's not actually the case. So with SIBO, it's bacteria that's been misplaced. And because the small intestine is meant to be a relatively clean environment, when there is an overgrowth of bacteria, that's when we can start to see these unwanted symptoms. And it's the reason why people might notice a worsening of symptoms when they take a supplement like a probiotic, or after eating prebiotic and probiotic rich foods, which is really common to see with cases of SIBO. As for her opportunistic or bad bacteria, there was quite a lot of overgrowth present, and these bacteria in particular are associated with SIBO. So it can be another factor pointing to potential overgrowth in the small intestine as well. Looking at her intestinal health markers, we can see that her enzyme production does need a little support, but her zonulin levels are really high. So this means that there is increased intestinal permeability or leaky gut, which is going to contribute to a lot of inflammation within the gut and more systemic symptoms in the body as well. So all of the factors that came back on her GI map test do point to SIBO being present, but we did run a SIBO breath test to determine the levels and the type of bacteria that is present, which can be really helpful, especially with trickier cases. And of course, it did come back positive. Now, in the past, she had worked with a dietitian and she tried going on a keto diet, but she didn't notice any improvements in her symptoms. So she also was recommended to take a probiotic supplement, which in this case was adding fuel to the fire and increasing her gut's bacteria levels. So although she was taking a supplement that's technically good for the gut, it was actually making her symptoms worse. So this last case that we're going to look at is something a little different, and it's something that I don't typically see come back very often, which is bacterial pathogens. And in this case, we're going to have a look at E. coli. So I find that a lot of individuals that do test positive for these pathogens are usually asymptomatic, meaning that they can't recall a time where they had a severe bout of food poisoning like diarrhea, abdominal pain, or vomiting. But regardless, when this does come back elevated on the test, it's definitely something that we want to address. So this individual struggled with lower abdominal bloating immediately after eating, constipation, and gas. So her beneficial bacteria levels were low, and it's your Commensal bacteria that inhibit the growth of harmful bacteria and pathogens like E. coli. So when they are low, E. coli can thrive without being harmed. And a common way to actually address E. coli is using high-dose probiotics, which is going to help restore balance within the microbiome and target the pathogen as well. So I also want to point out these 3 bacteria here that are elevated in the red because they have a direct correlation on supporting your gut's mucosal health. So they help to produce things called short-chain fatty acids and help to reduce inflammation in the gut. So having these come back low can definitely be a factor that's contributing to her symptoms. There wasn't a crazy amount of overgrowth present, but it is something that we do want to keep our eye on and potentially address if increasing her beneficial bacteria isn't enough to crowd these guys out. Finally, what I want to point out on her intestinal health markers is the elevated calprotectin. So as we know, this looked at intestinal inflammation, and because there was E. coli detected, this can definitely be the driving force to increase inflammation, as well as the elevated zonulin, which again points to increased intestinal permeability. Now, she worked with a naturopath in the past, but she wasn't able to get relief from her symptoms because these areas in particular weren't identified and therefore they weren't being properly addressed. So after going over all of these case studies, you can see that there are a lot of similarities between each of the individuals as it relates to their symptoms. So they each experienced lower abdominal bloating, constipation, gas, and some degree of abdominal discomfort, but had completely different results when we took a look at what was really going on inside their gut. Now, if they had gone to a practitioner that gave them a treatment plan based on their symptoms alone, which all of them had done in the past, they might receive very similar recommendations that aren't going to be effective for each of them. So, for example, if they were recommended to go on a gut detox and given antimicrobials, well, the individual with low amounts of beneficial bacteria is actually going to notice a worsening of symptoms. Or if they were recommended to take a probiotic, the individual that has high amounts of beneficial bacteria, again, is going to notice a worsening of symptoms as well. So this is why it's so important to have a complete picture of what's really going on inside the gut, instead of listening to the advice and recommendations that you see online that might have worked for someone else. Because as you've learned, you can have completely different imbalances in your gut that need to be addressed in a different way, even if your symptoms are the same. I use the GI map test with each of my clients, and it's often the missing link to helping them find the answers behind their symptoms and get on the right path with healing their gut. That's why I created the GI map interpretation package to be the perfect first step on your gut healing journey. So in this package, you will complete a GI map test to uncover what's really going on inside your gut and have an in-depth one-on-one interpretation session with myself going over your results, where you will then receive a 4-week customized treatment plan complete with nutrition, lifestyle, and supplement recommendations, as well as 1 week of one-on-one support with me so you feel completely confident with getting started. So if you're interested in learning more about this package, head over to my website for more information, or feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. That brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to hang out and learn more about the GI map test. I know it might have been a little information overload, so if you have any questions, my email is always open. Bye, guys.